Welcome to this peaceful storytelling of 6 stories from the Bible. These stories are written to help you find peace, to drop off into sleep while also increasing your Bible knowledge and help you to find rest in the beautiful biblical promises of God. Before we begin, I would love it if you could comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from. As you settle in, prepare to let go of the stresses of the day and enter a time of calm reflection. These stories are timeless reminders of the love, compassion, and unshakable care of our Heavenly Father. So, as you close your eyes or find a comfortable space, let these stories become a restful journey, one that reassures and comforts, and reminds you of the peace found in love that never fails. Let's begin with our first story. The story of the Good Shepherd. Once upon a time, in a quiet and gentle land, there lived a shepherd, a man of strength and kindness who cared for his sheep as if they were his family. This shepherd was unlike any other. He was wise and gentle, yet filled with courage. Every sheep in his flock was precious to him, and he treated each one as if it were the only sheep in the world. He loved them deeply, and his heart was set on their well-being and happiness. Every morning, just as the first light of dawn stretched across the hills, the shepherd would rise and begin his day. He would carefully check each sheep, calling them by name, one by one. His voice was calm and strong, a voice that each sheep knew well. The sound of his voice brought comfort and security, and every sheep would eagerly listen and respond, gathering close to him as he called them out from their resting place. The shepherd took his time, making sure that each sheep was healthy and well. He knew each one by the smallest details, the markings on their wool, the way they walked, the sounds they made. No 2 sheep were the same to him. Some were young and full of energy, often darting around with playful enthusiasm. Others were older, a bit slower, but wise and steady. Each one held a special place in the shepherd's heart. Once his flock was gathered, the shepherd would gently lead them out to the pastures. Unlike other herdsmen who might drive their sheep from behind, this shepherd always walked in front, showing his sheep the way, making sure the path ahead was safe. He was their guide and protector, and his sheep trusted him completely. They followed closely, knowing that he would lead them to places of peace, to fields filled with soft, green grass and cool, refreshing water. The journey to the pastures was often a gentle walk across rolling hills and through small valleys. The path sometimes grew narrow, winding along rocky ledges, but the sheep were not afraid. They knew their shepherd was ahead, watching over them, scanning the hills for any sign of danger. His eyes were sharp, and his senses keen, always alert to the slightest movement or sound that could signal harm. With his rod and staff in hand, he was ready to protect them from any threat, whether it was a lurking predator or the rough edges of the rocky trail. As they walked, the shepherd would occasionally pause, turning back to make sure that all were following safely. If any sheep lagged behind, distracted by a patch of grass or a curious sight, he would wait patiently or gently call them to rejoin the group. He knew that each sheep had its own pace, its own way of moving through the world, and he never rushed them. For the shepherd, their journey was as important as the destination. After a time, the shepherd would lead them to a broad, green pasture that lay nestled between hills, a place where the grass was thick and soft, stretching out in a gentle expanse under the morning sky. Here, the sheep could rest and graze to their heart's content. The meadow was a place of abundance and peace, a place the shepherd had chosen carefully, knowing it would bring delight and comfort to his flock. As the sheep grazed, the shepherd would keep watch, moving slowly around the pasture, his gaze sweeping the landscape. Occasionally, he would stop to pluck a thorn or a bramble from the wool of one of the sheep, or to gently lift a lamb that had stumbled. Every act was filled with care, each movement steady and kind. His hands were rough from work, yet his touch was gentle, a reminder to the sheep that they were loved and protected. The sheep grazed happily, enjoying the sweet, tender grass that grew in the pasture. They nibbled and wandered, sometimes bumping gently into each other or lying down to rest in the sun. The meadow was their haven, a place where they felt completely at peace. Here, under the shepherd's watchful eye, they knew no fear, no worry. The dangers of the wild seemed far away, and they could simply be, resting in the goodness of the moment. After the sheep had grazed for a while, the shepherd would lead them to a quiet stream that flowed nearby. The water was clear and still, sparkling under the sun's gentle rays. The shepherd knew that his sheep needed more than just food, they needed water to refresh and sustain them. And so he had chosen this place, with its cool, flowing stream, as a sanctuary for his flock. One by one, the sheep would step forward, bending down to drink from the stream. The water was clean and pure, flowing softly over smooth stones, a sound like a lullaby in the peaceful meadow. The sheep drank deeply, feeling the coolness of the water fill them with new life and strength. The shepherd watched them with satisfaction, knowing that they were safe and cared for. The stream was a place of renewal, a place where the sheep could pause and be refreshed. Some would linger by the water's edge, dipping their mouths into the stream, enjoying the calm and stillness. Others would sit by the bank, resting in the cool shade of the trees that grew nearby. For the shepherd, these moments of rest were precious. He knew that the journey was long, and he wanted his sheep to feel restored and at peace. As the day wore on, the shepherd would guide his flock further, leading them on a path that wound through shaded valleys and open fields. There were times when the trail led into darker places, narrow valleys where shadows gathered, and the way ahead seemed uncertain. The sheep would feel a chill in the air, and some would hesitate, sensing the unknown ahead. But even in these moments, the shepherd was with them. He walked ahead, his rod and staff in hand, his presence a steady assurance. He would call out to them, his voice a beacon in the shadows, and the sheep would follow, trusting in his guidance. They knew that as long as he was with them, they had nothing to fear. He was their protector, their defender, and he would not let them go. The shepherd was brave and strong, willing to face any danger that might come. He knew that valleys and shadows were part of the journey, but he also knew the way through. He would lead his flock safely through the darkness, bringing them back into the light, back to places of warmth and peace. His rod and staff were his tools, symbols of his care and his readiness to protect his beloved sheep from any harm. When evening came, the shepherd would lead his flock to a sheltered place where they could rest for the night. Here, he would prepare a safe enclosure, spreading fresh hay and making a comfortable resting place for his sheep. He would check each one carefully, tending to any scratches or wounds they might have received along the way. If a sheep was weary or injured, he would kneel beside it, offering comfort and care, anointing its head with oil as a balm to ease its pain. The shepherd took his time, moving gently among his flock, ensuring that each one was safe and secure. His care was tender and unwavering, a reminder to each sheep that it was valued and loved. When all were settled, he would sit nearby, keeping watch as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. His heart was filled with peace, knowing that his sheep were safe, that they could rest without fear. The sheep would curl up in the soft hay, feeling the warmth of their shepherd's presence. The night was quiet, the air cool and still, and the shepherd remained alert, guarding his flock through the long hours. He was their constant protector, their friend, and their guide. Under his watchful eye, the sheep drifted into peaceful sleep, their hearts at rest. Through the night, the shepherd would stay near, watching over his flock with love and vigilance. He knew that dangers could arise in the dark, but he was ready, prepared to defend his sheep from any threat. His love for them was a shield, a refuge that surrounded them, keeping them safe in the stillness of the night. And as the dawn broke once again, casting a gentle light over the land, the shepherd would rise, ready to lead his flock on a new day's journey. His love was endless, his care unwavering, and his sheep knew that they were blessed beyond measure to be held in the embrace of their good shepherd. The story of the Good Shepherd is a beautiful reminder of how deeply and completely God cares for us. Just as the shepherd knows each of his sheep, God knows each of us intimately, loving us as individuals, tending to our needs, and guiding us on safe paths. He leads us to places of rest, refreshes us when we are weary, and protects us through life's valleys. Tonight, as you reflect on this story, know that you are never alone. Like the sheep in the shepherd's care, you are watched over, loved, and protected. Let this knowledge bring you peace, and as you rest, remember that you are held in the gentle, unwavering embrace of the Good Shepherd. The journey of the Israelites through the wilderness. Many years ago, in the vast deserts stretching under the golden sun, there was a group of travelers, the Israelites, making their way through an endless wilderness. Their journey was unlike any other. It was not only a physical journey but a journey of trust and faith in God, who had promised to lead them to a land of peace and plenty. Day by day, they followed where God led, not knowing the exact way or what awaited them, but trusting in the one who guided them. As they set out from Egypt, where they had been enslaved for generations, the Israelites carried with them not only their belongings but also their hopes for a new life, a life free from hardship and filled with promise. The path through the wilderness was unknown, with only stretches of sand and rocky hills as far as the eye could see. The days were hot, the nights cold, and the journey sometimes seemed long and endless. But God did not leave them alone. From the very beginning, God provided for his people in ways they could hardly have imagined. By day, he sent a cloud, a great, billowing cloud that rose above them, leading the way. This cloud was more than just a guide. It shaded them from the blazing desert sun, cooling their path and reminding them that they were not walking alone. Whenever the cloud lifted and moved forward, the people knew it was time to pack up and follow. And when the cloud settled over them, they would stop and set up camp, resting under its shade, knowing that God was with them. By night, the cloud became a pillar of fire. This fire was bright and warm, lighting up the darkness and showing them the way. In the quiet stillness of the desert night, with the stars scattered above like diamonds, the fire burned as a constant reminder of God's presence. It brought comfort and peace to their hearts, a gentle reassurance that they were cared for, that they could rest without fear. The children would fall asleep under its glow, the elderly would warm their hands by its light, and all would feel the calm that comes from knowing they were held in God's care. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the Israelites learned to depend on God for everything. In the wilderness, there was little to eat, and food was scarce. But God knew their needs and, in his kindness, he sent bread from heaven. Early each morning, as the first light touched the horizon, the people would step out of their tents and find the ground covered with a delicate, white substance, manna. It was as fine as frost, and it tasted sweet, like honey wafers. The people were amazed. Each day, they gathered just what they needed for that day. They learned not to take more than their portion, for God would send manna each morning, faithfully providing for their daily needs. They did not have to store it up or worry about tomorrow, for God's provision was always there, fresh with each dawn. This manna became their sustenance, the gift that kept them strong for the journey. Mothers would gather it with care, preparing it into simple, nourishing meals for their families. Children would eat it, marveling at the sweetness, a taste that reminded them of the goodness of God. It was a humble food, simple yet filling, and each day it was a reminder that God was with them, caring for them, watching over them as they moved through the wilderness. Yet there were times when the journey grew difficult, and the people began to feel weary. The wilderness was vast, and the days were long. Sometimes, doubts would creep into their hearts, and they would wonder if they were truly on the path to the promised land. They would remember Egypt, where they had known what each day held, and even though life had been hard, they had felt a sense of security in the familiar. In those moments of doubt, they would cry out to God, and each time, God would respond with love and patience. When they grew thirsty and could find no water, God provided for them in miraculous ways. Once, as they traveled through a particularly dry and barren place, the people became parched. Their lips were dry, and their throats burned from thirst. In their desperation, they cried out to Moses, saying, "Why did you bring us out here to die of thirst?" Moses listened to their cries and then turned to God, asking for guidance. God, ever faithful, instructed Moses to strike a rock with his staff. When he did, fresh water gushed from the rock, flowing freely and abundantly, enough for everyone to drink. The people rushed forward, cupping their hands to drink the cool, clear water. They drank until they were satisfied, feeling their strength return and their spirits lifted. In that moment, they understood that God would not leave them, that He was a provider who cared for their every need. In another place, when the water they found was bitter and undrinkable, God showed Moses a piece of wood to throw into the water, making it sweet and refreshing. Each miracle was a reminder that even when the resources of the wilderness ran out, God's resources never would. He was a faithful provider, guiding His people, sustaining them in ways beyond their imagination. As the journey continued, the Israelites began to notice the rhythms of God's care. Day by day, manna appeared, night by night, the fire burned. In every trial, God showed them His strength, His faithfulness, and His unending love. Though the wilderness was wild and untamed, they could rest in the security of God's presence. His guidance was as steady as the rising and setting of the sun, as faithful as the stars that filled the night sky. Onward they traveled, their journey filled with moments of wonder and times of trial. When they encountered other tribes or faced threats, God was their protector. Once, as they were journeying through a dangerous area, they were attacked by enemies. Moses climbed to a hilltop, holding his staff high as a symbol of God's power and protection. As long as his hands were raised, the Israelites found strength to defend themselves. And when his arms grew tired, others came to support him, lifting his hands so that the people could stand strong until victory was won. God was their shield, their defender, always near, always ready to keep them safe. Through valleys and over mountains, the Israelites moved forward, learning to rely on God's voice and His presence. They became a people shaped by the wilderness, learning that true security was not found in things they could see or touch but in the One who led them. The wilderness was their teacher, a place where they discovered that God's promises were not just words but living truths that sustained them every step of the way. Finally, after many years of wandering, God brought them to the edge of the promised land. Standing at the border, they looked out over the rich, green hills, the fertile fields, and the flowing rivers. This was the land God had promised, a place of rest, a home where they could finally settle and build lives of peace and abundance. They had reached the end of their journey, and though the wilderness had been long and difficult, it had also been a time of growth, a time of learning to trust in God's unchanging faithfulness. As they stepped forward into their new home, they carried with them the memories of God's care, the taste of manna, the shade of the cloud, the warmth of the fire. They knew that God was not just a distant ruler but a loving Father who had walked with them every step of the way, guiding, providing, and protecting them through the wilderness. And so, whenever they looked back on their journey, they remembered the God who had been their guide and provider, their protector and friend. They remembered that even in the most desolate places, God had been with them, teaching them to trust, filling their hearts with peace. And though the path to the promised land had been long, they knew that every step had been worth it, for it had brought them closer to the heart of God. The journey of the Israelites through the wilderness reminds us of our own journeys in life, times when we walk through unknown paths and faced challenges that seem beyond our strength. Just as God guided, provided, and protected the Israelites, He does the same for us. Though we may not always see the way, we can trust that He is with us, leading us to places of rest and peace. Tonight, as you rest, remember that you are never alone. The same God who was with the Israelites in the wilderness is with you now, surrounding you with His love, providing for your every need, guiding you through every season. Let this knowledge bring peace to your heart as you close your eyes, resting in the presence of the One who walks beside you on every journey. Elijah and the gentle whisper on Mount Horeb. Long ago, in a time of great turmoil and change, there lived a prophet named Elijah. Elijah was a man devoted to God, a man with a heart for justice and truth. He spent his days speaking out against the injustices he saw, calling the people to return to God and reminding them of the goodness they had strayed from. But Elijah's life was far from easy, and the burdens he carried sometimes felt overwhelming. Elijah lived in a land where the people had forgotten their roots, where they worshipped idols and had turned away from the one true God. It was a time of drought and hardship, and as people looked for answers, they often placed their trust in false gods. Elijah, who loved his people, felt sorrow and frustration at seeing them follow paths that led them away from the peace and love of God. And so, he stood against these tides, standing alone on many occasions to call the people back to what was true and good. One day, Elijah found himself in a confrontation with the prophets of Baal, a false god many of the people had come to worship. They believed that Baal could bring rain, prosperity, and blessing, though none of it ever came. With God's guidance, Elijah challenged these prophets to a test on Mount Carmel, asking them to call down fire from their God to light an offering they had prepared. The prophets of Baal danced and chanted from morning until night, but their God remained silent. No fire came, and no answer was heard. When it was Elijah's turn, he prayed quietly to God, asking him to show his power, not for Elijah's sake but so that the people might see the truth and turn their hearts back to him. And in that moment, fire fell from the heavens, consuming not only the offering but even the stones of the altar. The people were astonished and fell to their knees, crying out that the Lord was God. This was a great victory for Elijah, and it seemed for a moment that the people would return to their faith. But Elijah's relief was short-lived, for soon after, he learned that Queen Jezebel, who worshipped Baal and opposed Elijah with fierce hatred, had heard of what he had done. Furious, she sent word to Elijah, promising to take his life in revenge. Overwhelmed with fear, Elijah fled into the wilderness. He had hoped that the people would change, that the battle he had fought on Mount Carmel would be the beginning of something new. But now, he was alone, running for his life, and his heart grew heavy with despair. He felt as if all his efforts had been in vain, that everything he had worked for was lost. In his sorrow, he sank to the ground beneath a solitary broom tree and cried out to God. Lord, he prayed, his voice barely a whisper, I cannot go on. I am no better than those who came before me. Take my life, for I am alone, and I have no strength left. Exhausted, Elijah fell asleep under the tree, his heart weary and his spirit burdened. But even in his despair, God was with him, watching over him with love and compassion. As Elijah slept, an angel appeared and gently touched him, saying, Arise and eat. Elijah opened his eyes and found a loaf of bread and a jar of water beside him. He ate and drank, feeling the warmth of the bread and the coolness of the water refresh his body. Then he lay down again and drifted back to sleep, resting in the quiet presence of God. A second time, the angel touched him and said, Arise and eat, for the journey is too much for you. Elijah awoke and once more ate and drank. This simple meal, prepared with divine care, gave him strength, a reminder that even in his darkest hour, God had not forgotten him. He was being sustained, not by his own strength but by the gentle provision of his Creator. Strengthened by this food, Elijah journeyed for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. This was a sacred place, a place where God had spoken to Moses and given him the commandments long ago. Here, Elijah found a cave and took refuge, sheltering in its quiet shadows. It was a place of solitude, far from the noise and strife of the world, and here, Elijah waited, unsure of what was to come but finding comfort in the silence. Then, in the stillness of the cave, God spoke to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah's heart was heavy as he replied, pouring out his sorrow. I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. The people have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death. I am the only one left, and now they seek my life to take it away. God listened, understanding the depth of Elijah's loneliness and frustration. Then he said to Elijah, Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for I am about to pass by. Elijah obeyed, stepping out of the cave and standing on the mountainside, his heart quieted in anticipation. As he waited, a great and powerful wind tore through the mountains, shattering rocks and shaking the earth. It was a mighty wind, fierce and overwhelming. But God was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, the ground trembling beneath Elijah's feet. The rocks split, and the earth shook with a force that could have moved mountains. But God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, a blaze that lit up the mountain, fierce and consuming. The flames danced and flickered, filling the air with heat and light. But God was not in the fire. Finally, after the fire, there came a gentle whisper, a sound so soft and quiet that it could barely be heard over the echoes of the wind and the earth and the fire. It was a still, small voice, a whisper that spoke not with power but with peace. In that gentle whisper, Elijah felt the presence of God, closer and more intimate than he had ever known. It was not in the mighty wind or the rumbling earthquake or the fierce fire that God came to him, but in the quiet of a still, small voice. In that moment, Elijah's heart was comforted, his fears eased, and his spirit lifted. He knew that he was not alone, that God was with him in ways he had not yet fully understood. Elijah wrapped his cloak around his face and stepped forward, drawn to the gentle voice that filled the silence. Once more, God asked him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah repeated his story, his sorrow and his fears. But this time, there was a calmness in his voice, a sense of peace that had not been there before. The quiet presence of God had stilled his heart, and though his circumstances had not changed, his spirit felt renewed. God then gave Elijah instructions, telling him to anoint new leaders who would continue the work he had started and to find Elisha, a man who would walk alongside him and eventually carry on his mission. Elijah was not alone. God had prepared others to support him, to share in the calling he had carried alone for so long. With a renewed heart, Elijah left Mount Horeb, knowing that he was not abandoned, that his life had purpose, and that God's quiet presence would be with him, no matter where his path led. He understood now that God was not only in the mighty acts but also in the gentle moments, in the whispers that could only be heard when the soul was quiet. As he walked down from the mountain, Elijah felt a sense of peace, a sense of trust that went deeper than before. He knew that he could rest in God's presence, that he could rely on his strength, and that even when he felt alone, God was always near. The journey ahead might still be challenging, but he would face it with a quiet confidence, strengthened by the encounter he had experienced on Mount Horeb. In his heart, Elijah carried the memory of that gentle whisper, the sound of God's voice, not in the storm or the fire but in the stillness. It was a reminder that God was with him in all things, that even in his loneliness and despair, he was never abandoned. That gentle whisper spoke of love, of peace, of a presence that would never fade. And so, Elijah continued his journey, not alone but with the assurance of God's constant presence. His heart was renewed, his spirit lifted, and he walked with a quiet strength, knowing that he was held in the hands of the one who spoke in whispers. The story of Elijah on Mount Horeb is a beautiful reminder that God meets us in our darkest moments, often in ways that are quiet, gentle, and unexpected. When we are overwhelmed, when life feels like a storm or an earthquake, God's presence comes to us as a whisper, a still, small voice that brings peace to our hearts. Tonight, as you rest, remember that God is with you. Even if you feel alone, even if the world around you feels turbulent, His gentle voice speaks peace to your soul. Close your eyes and know that you are not alone. God's whisper is with you, guiding, comforting, and surrounding you with His love. Rest in this truth, and let it bring calm to your heart as you drift into sleep. Jesus calms the storm on the Sea of Galilee. One warm evening, as the sun began to set over the rolling hills and olive groves, Jesus and his disciples prepared to cross the Sea of Galilee. It had been a long day, and Jesus had spent hours teaching the crowds who had gathered along the shore, listening with eager hearts to his words of hope and truth. By the day's end, Jesus was tired, and so were his disciples. With the sky painted in soft hues of pink and gold, they climbed into a small boat and pushed off from the shore. The Sea of Galilee was calm as they set out, its waters gently rocking the boat as they sailed toward the other side. The air was filled with the sounds of water lapping against the boat's sides, the occasional cry of a bird overhead, and the quiet murmurs of the disciples as they reflected on the teachings of the day. The calmness of the water mirrored the peaceful mood among the group, and for a while, all seemed serene. Jesus, exhausted from his day of teaching, found a quiet spot at the back of the boat, resting his head on a cushion. The gentle rhythm of the boat on the water soon lulled him to sleep. The disciples let him rest, grateful for this quiet moment after the busyness of the day. They knew how tirelessly he worked, and as they sailed along, they kept their voices low, careful not to disturb him. But as they traveled farther out into the open waters, the weather began to change. The breeze that had been so gentle grew stronger, and dark clouds started gathering in the sky. The disciples glanced at one another, noting the shift. They were familiar with the Sea of Galilee. They knew that storms could appear suddenly, transforming the calm waters into a raging sea in a matter of minutes. Before long, the wind picked up speed, whipping through the air with a force that caused the waves to rise. The boat rocked more violently, and the once peaceful waters turned choppy. Rain began to fall, softly at first, then harder, until it was pouring down in torrents. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the dark clouds, followed by the deep rumble of thunder that echoed across the water. The disciples felt the cold spray of the sea as waves crashed against the sides of the boat, sending water sloshing over the edge and into their feet. Panic began to set in as they worked together to keep the boat steady. Some bailed out water with whatever they could find, while others held tightly to the sides, bracing themselves against the force of the storm. The waves grew taller, each one threatening to overturn their small vessel, tossing them to and fro with an intensity that made their hearts race. The disciples were seasoned fishermen, used to the challenges of the sea, but this storm was unlike any they had faced before. They could feel the power of the wind, the relentless pounding of the waves, and with each passing moment, their fear grew. In the chaos, they remembered that Jesus was with them, sleeping at the back of the boat. The storm's noise was deafening, the wind howling, and the boat creaking under the strain, but still, Jesus slept. In their desperation, the disciples went to him, their voices filled with fear. "Master," they cried, "do you not care that we are perishing?" Their words were tinged with both fear and a hint of frustration. How could Jesus sleep through such a storm? How could he rest while they were fighting to stay afloat? Their trust wavered as the storm's strength seemed greater than they could withstand. Then, Jesus opened his eyes. He looked at the frightened faces of his disciples, then at the furious storm raging around them. With calm and gentle assurance, he rose and walked to the edge of the boat. The disciples watched, hearts pounding, as he lifted his hand, facing the roaring wind and surging waves. And then, in a voice that was both firm and filled with peace, Jesus spoke, "Peace, be still." At his words, a deep stillness settled over the sea. The winds that had howled with such ferocity died down, the waves that had risen like mountains sank back into gentle ripples, and the clouds began to part, revealing a sky once again painted in calm colors. The sea became as smooth as glass, and the air grew quiet, as if every part of creation had obeyed his command. The disciples stood in awe, their eyes wide as they looked at the tranquil sea around them. The transformation had been immediate, like a switch from night to day. Moments before, they had been surrounded by chaos, but now, there was only peace. The storm was gone, as if it had never been, leaving nothing but the gentle rocking of the boat and the quiet lapping of water against its sides. Jesus turned to his disciples, and in his gaze, they saw both compassion and a gentle rebuke. "Why are you so afraid?" he asked. "Do you still have no faith?" The disciples were silent, humbled by his words. They had been with him through miracles, had seen him heal the sick, feed the hungry, and teach with wisdom that surpassed any they had ever known. And yet, in the face of the storm, they had let fear take hold, forgetting that the one who was with them was greater than the storm itself. The quiet stretched out as the disciples pondered his words, each one feeling the truth settle within them. They realized that it wasn't the absence of storms that brought peace but the presence of Jesus, who had the power to calm any storm, both within and around them. They had felt the fear of the storm's fury, but now they understood that with Jesus, there was no need to fear, for he held all things in his hands. As they continued their journey across the now calm waters, the disciples reflected on what they had witnessed. They whispered among themselves, "Who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him?" They were beginning to see, perhaps for the first time, the depth of Jesus' power and love. He was not just a teacher or a healer, he was Lord over all creation, the one who could command the elements and bring peace with a single word. They felt awe and wonder, mixed with a profound sense of peace, knowing that the one who had power over the storm was with them, not only in moments of calm but also in times of turmoil. In the days that followed, the memory of that night stayed with them. When they faced challenges, they remembered the storm and the way Jesus had calmed it. They held on to the truth that even when the world around them seemed chaotic, they could rest in His presence. They understood that fear could not overpower them when they were with Jesus, for His peace was greater than any storm they would face. And so, whenever they looked back on that night, they found comfort and strength. They would remember the storm, the fear, and the way Jesus had spoken with calm authority, silencing the wind and waves. They would recall His question, gentle yet probing, reminding them to trust even when they could not see. And they would remember that the peace they felt in that moment was a gift, one that could carry them through any storm, for it was rooted in the presence of Jesus. As the boat reached the shore, the disciples stepped onto solid ground with a new understanding. They had seen, with their own eyes, the power of Jesus' words and the peace that flowed from His presence. It was a peace that did not depend on the circumstances around them but came from knowing they were in the care of one who loved them deeply. In the quiet moments of their lives, when they would pause to reflect, they would remember that storm and the peace that followed. They knew that no matter what storms they would face, they could carry that peace within them, for it was a gift from the one who calms all storms, who speaks to the raging seas of our lives and says, "Peace, be still." And as they lay down to rest at the end of each day, they held on to the assurance that Jesus was with them, calming not only the storms outside but also the storms within. With this knowledge, they could close their eyes, breathe deeply, and rest in the peace that comes from knowing they were held in His love. The story of Ruth and Boaz. In a small village in the land of Judah, there was a family that had once lived a happy life. Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, had called Bethlehem their home. They were a humble family, people of faith, content with their lot. But a famine struck the land, and the once bountiful fields and orchards of Bethlehem grew barren. The family faced hardship, and soon, it became difficult for them to find enough to eat. Faced with the harsh reality of survival, Elimelech made a decision that would change the course of their lives. He took his family to the land of Moab, a foreign place with different customs and gods. It was a land not far from Judah, but culturally worlds apart. The journey was not an easy one, but Elimelech hoped that in Moab they might find relief from the hunger and hardship they faced at home. For a time, it seemed as though they had found peace in this new land. Elimelech and Naomi's 2 sons eventually married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. Though they came from different backgrounds, the family grew close, bound by their shared lives and struggles. Naomi came to love Orpah and Ruth as her own daughters, and they, in turn, loved her deeply. But sorrow soon found them again. Elimelech, Naomi's beloved husband, passed away, leaving her heartbroken and grieving. She found comfort in her sons and daughters-in-law, but fate was unkind once more. Mahlon and Chilion, her sons, also passed away, leaving Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth as widows. The 3 women, bound now by shared grief, clung to each other for comfort and support. They faced a difficult future, for in those times, widows were often left vulnerable and without means to support themselves. Naomi, hearing that the famine had ended in Judah, decided to return to her homeland, Bethlehem. She urged her daughters-in-law to stay behind in Moab, to return to their own families, where they might have a chance to remarry and start anew. She knew that life would be difficult for them in Bethlehem, where they would be foreigners. With tears in her eyes, she kissed them goodbye, but Orpah and Ruth cried, saying they wanted to stay with her. Naomi, however, insisted. Eventually, Orpah tearfully agreed and returned to her family. But Ruth, her heart full of love and loyalty, could not bear to leave Naomi. She looked at her mother-in-law and spoke words that have been remembered through the ages: "Where you go, I will go, where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Naomi, seeing Ruth's determination, accepted her loyalty with a grateful heart. Together, they made the journey back to Bethlehem, two widows walking the dusty road home. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the people remembered Naomi and welcomed her back. But Naomi, still grieving the loss of her family, told them, "Do not call me Naomi, which means pleasant, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." Naomi's heart was heavy with sorrow, but Ruth's presence was a balm, a gentle comfort as they settled into their new life. In Bethlehem, Ruth and Naomi faced many challenges. They were poor and had no land or resources of their own. In those times, the harvest was a season of opportunity for those in need. After the fields were harvested, the reapers would leave behind stray stalks of grain, which the poor could gather for themselves. This practice, called gleaning, was a way for the community to care for the vulnerable, and it gave Ruth a chance to provide for herself and Naomi. With courage and determination, Ruth went to the fields to glean. She worked long hours in the hot sun, gathering what she could. She was a stranger in a foreign land, unfamiliar with the customs and the people, but her dedication and kindness soon caught the attention of Boaz, the owner of the field where she worked. Boaz was a kind and honorable man, known throughout Bethlehem for his integrity and generosity. He was also a relative of Naomi's late husband, though Ruth did not know this yet. One day, as Boaz observed the workers in his field, he noticed Ruth and asked his overseer about her. The overseer explained that she was the young Moabite woman who had come back with Naomi, her mother-in-law. He told Boaz of Ruth's hard work and devotion to Naomi, and Boaz's heart was moved with compassion and admiration. He saw in Ruth a strength and kindness that reminded him of his own mother, Rahab, who had also been a foreigner in Israel. Boaz approached Ruth as she worked in the field. He spoke to her gently, encouraging her to stay in his fields to glean, where she would be safe from harm and would not have to worry about gathering enough food. He assured her that she was welcome and that his workers would treat her kindly. Ruth was touched by Boaz's kindness and thanked him with a humble heart. When Ruth returned home that evening, her arms full of grain, she told Naomi about Boaz's kindness. Naomi's heart lifted, and she recognized the blessing of God's provision. She explained to Ruth that Boaz was a close relative, a kinsman redeemer, someone who could protect and care for them in their time of need. In the days that followed, Ruth continued to glean in Boaz's fields, and Boaz continued to show her favor, ensuring that she and Naomi had all they needed. As the harvest season came to an end, Naomi began to see that perhaps God had a larger plan in store for them. She advised Ruth to approach Boaz in a way that would let him know she sought his protection, following the custom of the time. Naomi instructed Ruth to wash and dress in her best clothes, to go to the threshing floor where Boaz would be winnowing grain, and to quietly lie at his feet, as a sign of her humility and trust. That night, Ruth did as Naomi had instructed. After Boaz had finished his work and was resting, Ruth quietly lay at his feet. When Boaz awoke in the night and saw her, he was surprised, but he spoke to her with kindness and respect. Ruth explained her situation, asking him to spread his cloak over her, a symbolic request for his protection and care. She was asking, humbly and with trust, for him to fulfill the role of a kinsman redeemer, to marry her and ensure the continuation of Naomi's family line. Boaz, touched by Ruth's courage and loyalty, agreed. He promised to do all he could to honor her request, but he explained that there was another relative closer in line who had the first right to act as kinsman redeemer. Boaz was a man of integrity and wanted to handle the matter honorably. The following day, he went to the town gate and spoke to the relative, explaining Ruth's situation. When the man declined, Boaz gladly took on the role, publicly declaring his commitment to care for Ruth and Naomi. With this act, Boaz became Ruth's husband, and their union was a blessing not only to themselves but to the entire community. Through Boaz's love and compassion, Ruth found a new home, and Naomi's heart, once filled with bitterness, was softened by the warmth of family and hope. In time, Ruth and Boaz were blessed with a son, whom they named Obed. As Naomi held her grandson in her arms, joy filled her heart. She saw in Obed the fulfillment of God's quiet plan, a plan she could not have seen through the veil of her own sorrow. The women of the village came to her, rejoicing with her, saying, "Praise be to the Lord, who has not left you without a family redeemer. May this child be famous in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Obed grew up in the warmth of his family, beloved by all who knew him. He would become the father of Jesse, who in turn would become the father of David, Israel's greatest king. And through David's lineage, generations later, another child would be born, a savior for all people, fulfilling God's promise of love and redemption for the world. Through Ruth's story, we are reminded of how God works quietly through our lives, even when all seems lost. Her journey, one marked by loyalty, humility, and quiet strength, teaches us that faithfulness and kindness can open doors to blessings beyond what we can see. Ruth's life, woven into the fabric of God's plan, was a testament to His grace and mercy. The story of Ruth and Boaz invites us to trust in the way that God's hand guides us through life, even in ways we might not understand. When we face uncertain times, when we feel like strangers or experience loss, we can remember that there is always a greater story being written. Just as Ruth found comfort and provision in Boaz's kindness, so too can we find peace and hope, knowing that God is with us, working in quiet, unexpected ways, bringing beauty and purpose out of even the most difficult of circumstances. And as you rest tonight, may this story remind you of the strength found in kindness, the quiet guidance of God's hand, and the peace that comes from knowing that in His love, we are never truly alone. The parable of the lost sheep. One day, as Jesus was traveling through the villages and towns, people gathered around Him, drawn by His words and the kindness that shone through every action. He was surrounded by a crowd of listeners, people from all walks of life, fishermen, farmers, merchants, mothers with children, and even some who had spent their lives as shepherds, caring for flocks in the open fields. Among those who listened were people the religious leaders looked down upon, tax collectors, whose work was seen as dishonest, and sinners, whose lives did not match the standards set by the religious laws of the day. These were people who had often felt judged, shunned, and excluded. But Jesus welcomed them. He listened to them, offered them kindness, and treated them with the respect and love they seldom received elsewhere. Some of the Pharisees, the religious leaders who carefully followed the laws of their faith, began to grumble. They muttered among themselves, questioning why Jesus, who claimed to be a teacher of righteousness, would associate with such people. "This man receives sinners and even eats with them," they said with disdain. They could not understand why a man who spoke so beautifully of God's kingdom would choose to spend time with those they considered unworthy. Hearing their murmurs, Jesus turned to them and began to share a story. In His gentle, compassionate voice, He said, "Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Does he not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it?" The crowd grew quiet, their attention fully on Jesus, as they imagined the scene He was painting with His words. In the hills and valleys of Judea, shepherds were well-known figures. The people understood the dangers and challenges of being a shepherd, for sheep are gentle and vulnerable creatures, easily lost and unable to defend themselves. The crowd knew that every sheep was precious to its shepherd, each one cared for as an individual. The sheep depended on the shepherd for everything: food, water, protection from predators, and guidance along safe paths. In this story, Jesus described a shepherd who had a flock of 100 sheep, a large number for one shepherd to tend alone. He knew each sheep by sight, perhaps even by name, for shepherds often spent so much time with their flocks that they came to know each animal's unique characteristics and behaviors. He could tell which sheep would run ahead, which ones would linger and graze, and which would stay close to his side. As the shepherd watched over his flock in the quiet of the evening, he carefully counted each one, calling them one by one, ensuring all were safely gathered together. But as he counted, he realized that something was wrong. There were only 99 sheep, one was missing. In that moment, the shepherd's heart must have quickened, not with frustration but with a deep sense of responsibility and love. Losing even one sheep was a serious matter, for a lost sheep was defenseless. Alone, it would be at the mercy of predators, steep cliffs, or deep ravines. Without the flock, it would be confused, vulnerable, and likely to wander farther away in search of its shepherd, making it even harder to find. So, without hesitation, the shepherd made his choice. He would leave the 99 in a safe place, trusting they would remain together, and set out to search for the one that was lost. He could not rest until he knew that each one of his sheep was safe. Though he knew the terrain would be rough, perhaps steep and covered with thorns, and that the night was drawing near, he did not waver. His love for each sheep was so great that he would go to any length to ensure their safety. The crowd, listening to Jesus' words, felt the warmth and tenderness in the story. They imagined the shepherd's determined steps as he climbed over hills, through rocky paths, calling out softly into the growing darkness, hoping to hear a faint bleating in return. For every listener, this story was beginning to feel personal. Perhaps some in the crowd, especially those who had been judged and rejected, felt as though they were like that lost sheep. They may have carried feelings of guilt, shame, or loneliness, wondering if they could ever be truly seen or valued by God. Jesus' story gave them a glimpse of a God who cared so deeply that he would not rest until each one of them was brought back, safe and sound. In the story, the shepherd continued searching, stepping over loose stones, through thick brush, calling the sheep's name again and again, his heart focused entirely on finding it. Then, after hours of searching, his patience and persistence paid off. There, perhaps caught in a thicket or trembling by itself in the shadow of a rock, was his lost sheep. Its wool may have been dirty and matted, its body tired and shaken, but it was alive. The shepherd's face softened with relief and joy. Without a word of scolding or frustration, he reached out to gently lift the sheep. In the darkness, on a rough and rocky path, he did not expect the sheep to walk beside him. Instead, he placed it over his shoulders, holding it securely with strong arms. It was a gesture of both protection and tenderness, an act of deep love that showed the sheep it was safe and valued. The shepherd walked back to the flock, carrying his lost sheep, his heart filled with joy and gratitude. And when he arrived, he did not keep his joy to himself. Instead, he called together his friends and neighbors, sharing the good news, saying, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep." The people who listened to Jesus could see it clearly in their minds, a shepherd, joyful and smiling, surrounded by his friends, celebrating the return of the lost sheep. In a way, this was a celebration of love, a celebration that each life is precious and worth seeking. Then, Jesus explained the meaning of the story, his voice gentle and filled with compassion. In the same way, he said, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. In this story, Jesus was revealing a truth about the heart of God. He was telling the people, and especially those who felt lost, unworthy, or overlooked, that God's love was not limited by human standards or judgments. God did not only care for those who seemed good or righteous, he cared deeply for each and every person, no matter how far they had wandered. In fact, God's heart went out especially to those who felt lost, those who had strayed, those who felt unworthy. And when one of them returned to him, heaven itself rejoiced. As the story sank in, the crowd began to understand its beauty. They saw that God's love was like that of a shepherd who would go to any length, climb any hill, search through any valley to bring each one of his children safely home. No one was too far, too lost, or too broken for God's love to find them. For the tax collectors, the sinners, and all those who had felt unworthy of God's love, this was a story of hope. It told them that, in God's eyes, they were not merely part of a crowd, not lost in a sea of people, but precious individuals whom he would never abandon. And for those who felt secure in their faith, it was a gentle reminder that the love of God extends far beyond human boundaries, a love that calls for compassion and understanding for all his children. The story of the lost sheep has endured through the ages because it reminds us of God's personal, relentless love. It tells us that each person has worth, that no one is beyond God's reach, and that God's heart rejoices each time one of us turns back to him. Just as the shepherd carried his lost sheep home on his shoulders, so God carries us, lifting us up with strength and tenderness, guiding us back to a place of safety and belonging. As the people listened to Jesus, many found themselves deeply moved, their hearts touched by this message of unconditional love. Some felt a weight lift, a reassurance that they, too, were known and valued. And as they walked away, they carried with them a sense of peace and hope, knowing that no matter how lost they might feel, there was a shepherd who would search for them, who would never rest until they were brought back into the fold. For all who have ever felt lost, forgotten, or far from God, the parable of the lost sheep is a reminder that they are not alone, that they are cherished, and that they are loved with a love that will never give up. In this quiet and peaceful truth, we find rest, knowing that we are held in the tender care of the Good Shepherd. And as we close our eyes tonight, we can rest in the knowledge that we are never truly alone, for he is always with us, ready to guide us, protect us, and bring us home. As we come to the end of our journey through these comforting stories, let's take a moment to reflect on the messages we've shared tonight. We began with the story of the Good Shepherd, a beautiful reminder of the unwavering love and care God has for each of us, just like a shepherd cares for his sheep. Then, we walked alongside the Israelites as they journeyed through the wilderness, discovering how God provided for them and led them through every challenge. In Elijah and the gentle whisper on Mount Horeb, we learned that sometimes God speaks to us in the quiet moments, encouraging us to listen for his presence in the stillness of our hearts. Next, we witnessed Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee, illustrating how his power and peace can quiet the storms in our own lives. We then delved into the story of Ruth and Boaz, a beautiful tale of loyalty, love, and redemption, reminding us of the strength found in kindness and the providence of God. Finally, we explored the parable of the lost sheep, where Jesus taught us about the value of each individual and how God will seek us out with relentless love, ensuring that none of us are ever truly lost. As you reflect on these stories, may you find comfort in knowing that you are valued and cherished. Each narrative serves as a gentle reminder of God's presence in our lives, guiding us, providing for us, and loving us unconditionally. Now, as you prepare for restful sleep, let us take a moment to pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the stories shared tonight and the lessons of love, peace, and hope they impart. We ask for your gentle hand to guide us into a night of restful sleep. May our hearts be filled with peace, our minds be free from worries, and our spirits be renewed. Remind us of your presence as we sleep, knowing that you watch over us, just like a shepherd cares for his flock. Help us to awaken refreshed and ready to embrace the day ahead, filled with your love and grace. Amen. If you found comfort in these stories and feel inspired, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Join our Christian community where we share stories of faith, hope, and love, encouraging one another on our spiritual journeys. Thank you for being with us tonight. May God bless you with sweet dreams and a peaceful heart as you rest. Good night.